Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Today we are reviewing season 2 of Loki in its entirety, with all episodes streaming now on Disney+. And Loki season 2 explores the fallout and the repercussions of killing He Who Remains, with all the timelines branching off into this multitude of endless possibilities. Now, I was not the biggest fan of Loki season 1. When I say I wasn't the biggest fan, I thought it was a real waste of bringing Loki back. I think it failed to justify that decision to revive him after I think he had a perfect kind of narrative arc in the films. And to me, season 1 of Loki really felt like it was just missing the opportunity to do anything unique with this character. I think the way he was written, the way he was played was very against type, considering he was just coming off the back of being a genocidal maniac. I feel like they rushed his growth and forced a kind of love interest dynamic with him and Sylvie. It all just felt very inauthentic to who the character was, and in the 6 episodes it didn't feel like they'd earned the journey that Loki went on. It also had an ensemble cast who I don't think really were given much room to do anything with their characters. I don't think the characters were particularly well written or well rounded. There were 2 good elements to season 1, and that was Natalie Holt's music, the visual style, and to be fair, the finale was quite good with the introduction of Jonathan Majors. So I am massively relieved to say that season 2 was a massive improvement, to the point where I actively really enjoyed the way it built up and where it all led to. The show felt like it had found its footing tonally, in terms of the writing, in terms of the visuals, in terms of this kind of narrative structure and what it was all leading to. The biggest difference for me between the 2 seasons is the way it handles Loki himself. I feel like season 2 recaptures a lot of the complexity and a lot of the shades of grey that were completely absent in season 1, where they really kind of tried to emphasise the sympathetic, gentle, innocent side of Loki in a very ham-fisted and forced way. Whereas season 2, it kind of flits back and forth and flirts with that moral grey that I think makes Loki a very compelling character. And I think the places he has to go and the journey he has to really experience felt like much more of a leading role this time round. Whereas in season 1, it felt like he was just being thrust into different scenarios without really having much grasp on them. Season 2 feels like this kind of born leader that we all know and love. He feels like a main character and gives off main character energy, which is exactly what you want. It was also a massive improvement in terms of the general cast. I still don't think the returning characters from season 1 are particularly memorable or given anything resembling fun arcs. I think Owen Wilson's great, but I think Mobius is a very one-note character. The same with B-15. But thankfully the additions of Quan as Ouroboros and Jonathan Majors as Victor Timely really brought a fresh energy to the mix in season 2. Ouroboros being this very kind of playful, overly excited, hyperactive scientist, Victor Timely being this kind of bumbling, stuttering, insecure, but brilliant scientist, really lent the show a much more organic and fresh feel. It didn't feel forced, which is where a lot of the Marvel films and TV shows fall apart in terms of tone. It's a lot of the comedy is forced, a lot of the character traits feel forced, whereas Quan and Jonathan Majors really just embraced who these characters were in a way that felt organic. Sylvie was also much less jarring this time round as a character, and I think that's because they weren't forcing this kind of romantic love interest role onto her, because I don't think there was really any chemistry or any screen time devoted to the build-up of that in season 1. And in season 2 it feels much more like a sibling frenemy relationship that just works a lot better on the page. I also really loved how high concept this season was. A lot of the Marvel films and shows really annoy me because you can see the potential in the idea, and the execution of the idea is so lacklustre and so subpar. Whereas Loki season 2 really has to deal with a massive scale concept, you know, branching timelines, control of fate, who controls autonomy, to what extent do you have free will. All those questions are kind of thrown into the mix. And while I think it's definitely something that could have been explored much more, it does a really admirable job of balancing that high scale concept with a very small scale production. And Loki feels like a really interesting character to put at the epicentre of that debate. And what was really interesting about season 2 is that there was not really a kind of big bad. There wasn't really an overarching villain. It was basically the lack of that, the lack of a specific person to defeat, and just having this massive existential threat to kind of contain and control that provided the foil for most of this season. And that was really refreshing in and of itself, because it's basically these characters trying to solve a problem rather than defeat an enemy boss, and really allowed the characters that growth of figuring out who they were and who they needed to be in order to overcome these obstacles. Natalie Holt's music in this season really one-upped itself from season 1. I think it was one of the only good components of season 1, but it improves massively here, especially in the finale. I think the production design as well really helped emphasize the scale of the TVA, because that's another thing I hated about season 1, is how this massive kind of fate controlling organization was reduced to what looked like a very bland administrative office. And although I know that's the look they were going for, it just really undermined the whole concept and made the TVA look like a gimmick, which I don't think helps sell the magnitude of the idea and what it was supposed to represent. I still think at times they fail at capturing the scale of what this is and what this represents, because it was early on in the show, episode 3 I think it might have been, when they kind of had to stop some rogue TVA members from pruning a lot of the timelines and wiping entire timelines from existence. It just felt like our main characters fighting a few goons without fully capitalizing on what that moment signified. It was basically genocide happening on a mass scale, but when you're watching the episode it feels like a very undermining skirmish. So I think that's when the show falters a little bit, when it doesn't lean into the fact that the TVA and the characters in that are basically playing God, that they are basically controlling mass extinction, and we don't really get a sense of the humanity of that and the weight of that and the loss of that at times. But it all builds to a finale that kind of ties up both seasons, to be fair. It ties up, I think, who Loki was in the original timeline. I think it just feels like a really earned place to end it, and I think that final 5 minutes in Loki season 2 of him kind of walking up, weaving the threads of fate into this kind of tree of Vatrasil looking symbol and taking his rightful place on the throne just felt like a very poetic and very cathartic place to end his character. It felt like a tragically fitting way for him to wrap up that narrative, and visually, musically, you were just really on board for that ride. It was a very satisfying end to a season that only got better as it went along. A ginormous improvement over season 1, and that's all you can really ask for, is for showrunners to recognise mistakes, build on those, and continue to show an evolution in terms of quality, and that's what Loki has definitely done. And so do drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Please also consider liking and subscribing to the channel, that's always a huge help for me, and in the meantime we'll see you for the next bit.